Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua with Dr. Daniel Cantey. As the modern order enters its apparent sunset, Dr. Cantey looks anew at the ancient scriptures to learn what they teach about man and his world. Here he is with today's episode.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Old Testament and the New Man. My name is Daniel Cantey. In this episode, we're going to start our investigation of the book of Numbers. Now, the book of Numbers is quite a long book. It is 36 chapters long, so it's going to take at least one lecture for us to finish it. And we'll get through some of the main portions of the first half of it tonight. It's called Numbers, this book, because there are two times that a census is taken. And so we're given a count of the number of the people of Israel, which we'll get into in just a moment, the meaning of that census. But before we get into the book, I want to give a broader summation of the main theme of the book of Numbers, at the very least, the first 2/3 of the book of Numbers. And to sum up this book in a single word, it would be faithlessness. That the people of Israel are now going to be moving from Sinai to the Promised Land, but over and over again, they are faithless. Over and over again, they challenge God, or they grumble against God, or they reject or question God's leaders. Over and over again, they are faithless. And so we're going to see in this particular book of Numbers a guide for what not to do if you're trying to follow God faithfully, if you're trying to be obedient and to rest in God's promises. We're going to see the opposite of that in several instances as we look at what the Israelites do on their way from Sinai to the Promised Land. Now, those of you who know something about the book of Numbers, you know the story of the spies and how the people don't think that they'll be able to defeat the people who are inhabiting Canaan, the Canaanites and the various tribes that are there. That story, yes, we will go over, but that is one of several stories that we will see as we look in this book. Now, we're going to be jumping around a bit. There are chunks of chapters that we will skip over, but we are going to hit the highlights of the story and what it has to tell us about Israel's relationship with God and how it is that Israel fails, because they fail in many ways. So, all of that said, to set the stage for what's going to come here, let's start with chapter 1 of Numbers. Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tabernacle of testimony on the first day of the second month in the second year after they came out of the land of Egypt, saying, "Take a census of all the congregation of the children of Israel, and according to their families by their fathers' houses, and according to the number of names by their head count, every male from 20 years old and above, all who go out with the army of Israel. You and Aaron shall number them by their armies." What we have here is not a count of the people of Israel for the sake of knowing how many people there are in general, men, women, and children. What is being counted here are soldiers, because the people of God are now transformed at the beginning of the book of Numbers from liberated slaves who are going to receive the law of their God to the army of God. They are an army that is setting out to occupy the land that God intends to give them. So their organization and their sense of purpose and their sense of mission takes on a new tone. It has a new motivation, we might say. They are leaving to go and take what is theirs as God has promised it to them. And they are leaving as an army for that taking, to accomplish what it is that God has set out for them to do. Now, as you go through the first chapter, the tribes are listed, all of them except for the tribe of Levi, which takes care of the tabernacle, and there are numbers of soldiers for each tribe. I'm going to skip the individual numbers per tribe and go straight to the total. Chapter 1, verse 45. So the entire census of the children of Israel with their armies, and from 20 years old and above, all who were able to go out to war in Israel, was 603,550. 603,550. That's a lot of soldiers. That's larger, by comparison, than the American army today. which at last count that I'm aware of was somewhere between 500 and 550,000. That's not including the Air Force and the Navy and the Marines. That's just the Army. But this is larger than the American Army. And if you were to hypothesize the total number of people of Israel, i.e., if you include wives and children and the very elderly, if you include all those folks, you're talking about well over 1 million people, probably closer to 2 million people, maybe something along those lines. That's a lot of folks. That's a lot of people moving across the desert. And it's a very large and imposing army that we're talking about, moving across the desert. When other tribes and other peoples would hear about this, they have some reason to be a little afraid, because it's not like a small tribe of people is moving across the desert. No, this is a great mass of people with a great mass of soldiers moving around the desert. Now, to add to the sense, the military sense, we might say, of the people of Israel, we can see how it is that they are organized for movement when they go from one place to another. Now we're in chapter 2 of Numbers. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Let the children of Israel, each man according to his division and military standard, camp according to their fathers' houses, around and facing the tabernacle of testimony." So what I want you to imagine here is a circle, and the circle represents the people of Israel when they are camping. And when I say camping, I mean that they have stopped along the way to the promised land. And the tabernacle is in the middle. The Levites would be there with the tabernacle in the center of the people. And what we are going to see is that there are 3 tribes on the north, 3 tribes on the east, 3 tribes to the south, and 3 tribes to the west. Now you may say to yourself, hold on, if there's 12 tribes and then the Levites in the middle, that makes 13 tribes. Well, remember that Joseph, the tribe of Joseph, is actually divided in 2. So you have the half tribe of Manasseh and the half tribe of Ephraim. That's where you get the number of 13 to account for all of the tribes. But in any case, how are they lined up? Well, to the east of the tabernacle are the tribes of Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. To the south of the tabernacle are the tribes of Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. And when they would leave, that is, when the Israelites would break camp, these 2 groups would leave, the tribes in the east and then the tribes from the south, and then the Levites in the tabernacle would break camp in the middle. To the west are Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. And then to the north are the tribes of Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. So not only are they organized in terms of being an army, in terms of now you have these different armies of the tribes, and there's a census taken, so you know how big the armies are. But when they move like an army. They move with organization. They move with a purpose. Again, they are going to take a land by military force. They are going to war. So it should be clear that the character of the people has transformed according to their purpose. And according to the promises, we should add, that God has given to them for what it is that they are about to do. Now that we have this beginning, we can skip forward into Numbers, where the story picks up in chapter 9. So we're going to skip several chapters that have to do largely with the Levites and come to the story. What happens? Chapter 9, verse 1, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the Sinai desert in the first month of the 2nd year, after they came out of the land of Egypt, saying, 'Speak and let the children of Israel keep Pascha at its appointed time. On the 14th day of this month at eventide you shall keep it at its appointed time. According to its rule and practice you shall keep it.' Thus they kept Pascha on the 14th day of the first month in the Sinai desert." So around the time that they are beginning to move, they actually remember what happened in Egypt. So they have the festival where they remember the liberation. And this is in the background before they move forward. Remember, the beginning of the nation of Israel as a people is the Exodus event. They are called out of slavery. This is their birth moment before they come to Sinai. And having received the law at Sinai, they progress on the way to the promised land. So here they remember where it is that they have come from, as it were. Now they, in chapter 10, begin to move on from the camp. They begin to break camp here from the mountain of the Lord. This is chapter 10, verse 33. The Israelites broke camp at the mountain of the Lord for a journey of 3 days, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord went before them for the 3 days' journey to search out a resting place for them. Now it came to pass when they broke camp with the ark, Moses said, "Rise up, O Lord, let your enemies be scattered, and let all who hate you flee." And when the ark rested, Moses said, "Return, O Lord, to the many thousands in Israel." And the cloud also overshadowed them by day when they broke camp. Now, if you are Orthodox, the quote from Moses here would hopefully ring in your ears as coming from the Paschal service. Moses says, "Rise up, O Lord, let your enemies be scattered, and let all who hate you flee." As we sing in the Paschal service, "Arise, O God, let your enemies be scattered, let all who hate you flee from before your face." So if you're wondering where it is that that particular line of the Paschal service comes from, it comes from here in Numbers, when the people are going to the promised land. "Arise, O God, let your enemies be scattered, let those who hate you flee, because we," that is the people of ancient Israel, "are going to the place of rest that you have promised for us." We are going to the promised land. And in the Paschal service, when we sing about the resurrection of Christ, that same spirit should be in our hearts. "Arise, O God, let your enemies be scattered," because we, through the sacrifice of Christ, seek to move forward to the promised rest, that is, to eternal life, to communion with God, to life with God, as much as possible in this world and also in the next. "Arise, O God, let your enemies be scattered, let all who hate you flee. For we march forward, bearing the standard of our Christ, and in submission and obedience and faith to him, that we should also come to rest in that place that you would give to us." An echo, then, of our own services here being drawn from the Old Testament. Chapter 11. We move forward. And here we see the first of the failures of the people, the first time in this instance that they grumble against God. Before we get to this story, I want to point out that it bears very strong resemblances thematically to what we saw in Exodus chapter 18. Exodus chapter 18 was the story of Moses judging the people, and Jethro comes to Moses and says, "You can't bear this alone. You need to get people to help you. You're surely going to wear yourself out if you keep doing this." And it was a mundane story that we talked about all the way back when we were discussing Genesis chapter 2. But that story is important because it shows us the necessity of rest. Remember, as I've said throughout this series of episodes, this podcast, rest is holy. Rest is absolutely central. We're going to see that at work here again in Numbers 11. It's as though we have a repetition of what happens in Exodus 18. The story isn't exactly the same, but as I've noted, the themes are going to be very, very similar. So let's see what happens here. Chapter 11. Now the people were grumbling evilly against the Lord, and the Lord heard them and was provoked to anger. So the fire of the Lord burned among them and utterly destroyed part of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire was quenched. And this is kind of a pre-story. We see Moses interceding for the people, and the anger of God already stirred up, but things are going to get a little bit worse. Verse 4. Now the mixed multitude among them hungered exceedingly, and sitting down, the children of Israel were also weeping, and said, "Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish we ate freely in Egypt, and the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our soul is dried up, and there is nothing before our eyes except this manna." And the manna, we are told a couple of verses later, had a flavor that was like the taste of a pastry prepared with oil and honey. So even though the manna was evidently quite tasty, the people were getting tired of it. The people were asking for meat, and they were remembering the good things that they had in Egypt. And we're going to pause here for just a moment and let St. John Cassian speak to us on this particular passage. He writes, quote, "We would be censured along with those who dwelled in the desert and who desired the disgusting food of vice and filthiness after having eaten the heavenly manna, and we would seem to complain like them. It was well with us in Egypt when we sat over pots of flesh and ate onions and garlic and cucumbers and melons. Although this manner of speaking first referred to that people, nonetheless we see it now daily fulfilled in our life and profession. And here's the main point. For everyone who has first renounced this world and then returns to his former pursuits and his erstwhile desires, proclaims that in deed and in intention he is the same as they were. And he says, "It was well with me in Egypt." End quote. And so what St. John is telling us is that if we have converted and we have left off the ways of the world, those ways that were harmful to us and that took us away from God, and if, after walking the Christian life and setting out upon the Christian path for some period of time, we return to those habits and those desires, we become in spirit like the children of Israel who said, "Would that we were back in Egypt." Because by our habits and our desires, we put ourselves back where we were before God had freed us from our passions. And so there's a lesson here, I think a really stinging lesson that St. John Cassian gives to us about how it is that we might look at the people who left Egypt and in them see ourselves if we are ones who have turned back to the things that God had freed us from, turned back to slavery, to our passions. Moving on with the story. So the people are saying they want meat and they're grumbling against God. Verse 10. Then Moses heard the people weeping throughout their tribes, everyone at his door, and the anger of the Lord was greatly aroused, and Moses also was displeased. And so Moses speaks to God here, and this is as close to Moses being stressed out as we are going to get. Moses clearly seems frayed at what he has to say here. And we are told in a couple of chapters about how meek Moses is, that Moses was a very meek man. But here he seems certainly burdened by what is happening around him. So Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you maltreated your servant? Why have I not found grace in your sight that you lay the wrath of this people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I beget them, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a guardian carries a nursing child to the land you swore to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give all these people? For they weep all over me, saying, 'Give us meat that we may eat.' I am not able to bear this people alone, because the burden is too heavy for me. If you treat me like this, kill me here and now if I find mercy in your sight, and do not let me see my maltreatment." I'm going to stop here for just a moment. Just as we saw in Exodus 18, where Jethro assesses that Moses is not able to bear the burden of the people alone, because he sits there alone and judges all of them all day, from the early morning until the late evening, and he's wearing himself and the people out by doing this. Here again, the point is that there is a burden involving all of the people and that Moses is not able to bear it alone. The burden has become too heavy for him. Remember, there's 2 million people, roughly, give or take. That's kind of an educated guess. The same number of people that we saw in Exodus when they left Egypt. But here again, the burden of all those people is pressing down on Moses, and he has no rest. Clearly, this is weighing on him. It is causing him anxiety. So the Lord said to Moses, here's the response, "Gather me 70 men from the elders of Israel, whom you yourself know to be elders of the people and officers over them. Bring them to the tabernacle of testimony so they may stand there with you. And I will take of the Spirit upon you and put him upon them." And this is the Holy Spirit that is being discussed. The Holy Spirit that was with Moses is now going to be put on these 70 elders. "And they shall help you," God continues, "to bear the wrath of the people, that you yourself may not bear them alone." So the solution that we saw in Exodus 18 was that Moses would have subordinate judges beneath him to handle smaller matters that the people might bring. In this particular case, the Spirit that is on Moses is put on 70 others, and they are to bear the weight of the people with him. So again, he no longer bears it alone. His burden is relieved. He is given rest from his anxiety in this case. In addition, There is a punishment for the people for grumbling against God in desiring meat. God says to Moses, "Tell the people, you shall eat not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor even 20 days, but for a whole month you shall eat meat, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you disobeyed the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, 'Why did we ever come out of Egypt?'" And so God is going to give them the meat that they crave, but because they craved it disobediently, and because they spurned God's mercy in liberating them, and they looked lightly on it, he says that he will give them meat, but that it will be loathsome to them. And so the 70 elders, 68 of them to be precise, are gathered outside of the tabernacle, and the Lord descends in the cloud and speaks to Moses, and took the spirit that was upon him and put it upon the 70 men of the elders. And when the spirit rested upon them, they prophesied. But there were 2 of the men, Eldad and Medad. They were among the elders who had been registered, but they had not come to the tabernacle. Yet they prophesied in the camp in any case. So even though they weren't present before the tabernacle, they were still able to prophesy. They still received of the Spirit. When this happened, Joshua, the son of Nun, who is Moses' right-hand man, more or less, in this situation, he comes to Moses and said, "Lord Moses, forbid Eldad and Medad. They were not here. Forbid them from prophesying." And then Moses said to him, "Are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people might be prophets, when the Lord would put his Spirit upon them." And here we see the humility of Moses, that Moses doesn't want the Spirit of God reserved for himself. He would rather it be with everyone. After all, if he has been anxious and felt a terrible burden in this series of events, would he not want that burden relieved? And would he not be so humble that he would desire to see the Spirit of God amongst all of his brethren? About this passage and about Eldad and Medad not being at the tabernacle, St. Cyril of Jerusalem has this to say, quote, "The Spirit descended upon the 70 elders in Moses' day. My object is to prove that he knew all things, that is, that God knew all things, and worked according to his will. The 70 elders were chosen. The Lord then came down in the cloud, and taking some of the Spirit that was on Moses, he bestowed it on the 70 elders. It was not that the Spirit was divided, but his gifts were distributed according to the vessels and the capacity of the recipients. Now there were 68 present, and they prophesied. Eldad and Medad were not present, to make it clear that it was not Moses who bestowed the gift, but the Spirit who wrought. Eldad and Medad, who had been called, but had not yet presented themselves, also prophesied," end quote. And in other words, what St. Cyril is telling us is that it's important that Eldad and Medad were not there, because it shows that it is God who is in control. That it's not Moses bestowing the gift, but it is God bestowing the gift as he wills. And so he says, "Call them all to the tabernacle," and he calls all of them to the tabernacle and takes the Spirit that was upon Moses and puts it upon all of them. But even those who were not present, and we don't know exactly why they weren't present, but they didn't make it there, even those 2 who were not present at the appointed place and time still received the Spirit according to God's will, so that it is not ultimately up to Moses whether or not people receive the Spirit, but up to God. Now, moving on with the story and having seen how Moses' burdens have been relieved and how he is given rest from his anxiety, again, an echo from what we see in Exodus chapter 18. Moving on from that story, God gives the people meat. "A wind went out from the Lord and brought birds from the sea that migrate together with quail, and cast them upon the camp, about a day's journey on this side and about a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp above the surface of the ground." So the birds are literally piled up around the camp. This is where their meat is going to come from. And so God gives them what it is that they desired. "Then the people stayed up all that day, all night, and all the next day, and gathered the birds, and they spread out the meat to dry for themselves all around the camp. But while the meat was still in their teeth, before it was chewed, the Lord's anger was aroused against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very great plague." And so things go bad for the people even while they are getting what it is that they wanted. Because, again, they sought this against the Lord, grumbling against God, not in humility and in meekness and in gratitude, but with hard hearts, as it were. And so we see this first failure of the people, the grumbling against God. The army of God that is moving out to take the promised land, they show already that they are dissatisfied as they begin to move out. That's the first instance of grumbling against God, the first instance of failure or of faithlessness, we might say. But we see a second instance, and in this case, here in chapter 12, it's not the entire people. It's what we might call the command group for those who were in the military. It's Moses now having his brother Aaron and his sister Miriam rebelling against him. So it's these three who are near the very top of the Israelite ladder in terms of their family relations, and Moses being the clear leader, Aaron being the priest, and Miriam being a member of the family. Among these three, there is dissension. Chapter 12, verse 1. Now Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he married, for he married an Ethiopian woman. So they said, "Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also?" And so they want to put themselves on the same level as Moses, although God has clearly chosen Moses to be the leader. Miriam and Aaron say, "Well, look, he married an Ethiopian woman. If he does this and God speaks through him, can God not also equally speak through us? Do we not have equal standing with him?" But the Lord heard it. And it's here we're told that the man Moses was very meek, more than all men on the face of the earth. And I want to pause here for a moment to see what the fathers have to say about Moses and his meekness. First, from Gregory of Nyssa, quote, "It is said of Moses that he was superior to anger and desire. History testifies that he was the meekest of men, and incapacity for anger is shown through mildness and aversion to wrath. He desired none of the things towards which the desiring element in many people is directed. This would not have been so if these qualities had been natural to him and logically in keeping with his essence, for it is not possible for that which is unnatural to remain in the essence. Moses, you see, was true to his essence and not involved in anger and desire, which are in addition to our nature and not our nature itself, for nature is truly that in which being has its essence," end quote. And the point here is that the essence of man as created by God is not anger and desire. That anger and desire were not natural to Moses. They were not of his essence. He recognized them, as it were, as being in addition to nature, not nature itself. And he sought to be that kind of man that God has made him to be and made all of us to be as bearers of the image of God according to that essence, not creatures of anger and desire. Moses, again, the meekest of all men. Let's see what St. John Chrysostom has to say about Moses, and there's a comparison here between Moses and the Christ that he's going to make in a few different ways. St. John writes, quote, "What was the characteristic of Moses of old? Moses was the meekest of all men on earth. One would not be wrong in describing this other Moses, i.e. Christ, in these same terms. For certainly the meekest of spirits is with him, being related to him by consubstantiality. In those days Moses stretched forth his hands to heaven and brought down the bread of angels, manna. This second Moses, that is Christ, stretches forth his hands to heaven and brings down the food of eternal life. Moses struck the rock and made streams of water flow. This second Moses touches the table, strikes the spiritual board, and makes the fountains of the Spirit gush forth. Consequently, the table, like the fountain, lies in the middle, in order that the flocks may surround the fountain on every side and enjoy the benefit of the saving waters." End quote. And so we see a kind of comparison of Moses of old and Christ in the new dispensation, in the new era, here given to us by St. John Chrysostom. As the Gospel of John says, the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And I want to focus for just a moment on the notion of the new man, what it is to be a new man, and how Moses is an example for us. We've already seen Moses as a man of prayer. Now we see him as a man of virtue. And that virtue is meekness. As we are told by St. Gregory, he was superior to anger and desire. To be a man of meekness is not to have the passion of anger take control, not to have the passion of anger dominate, not to have the passion of anger seize one's tongue and dictate one's words, not to have the passion of anger dictate one's thoughts. We also see that meekness is to be superior to desire, not to have desire seize one's emotions or seize the thoughts of one's mind or seize ultimately one's actions. To be a new man is to be a man of virtue, to be a man of meekness. And if we are to follow the example of Moses, who is placed in leadership by God, leadership was not an excuse for domination, not excuse for bald exertions of power, but an opportunity for service in a spirit of meekness, to be the spokesman for God to the people, but at the same time one with a profoundly humble heart, one whose heart was fixed on obedience to God, desired to be in the presence of God, and service to his neighbors. And so we see all this in Moses here, and would hopefully see in it as well a motivation for us to strive after similar virtues. But Moses has found himself at odds with Miriam and Aaron, who have spoken against him without right, through no real cause. His marriage of the Ethiopian woman is not seen as a cause for their enmity with him. So the Lord had heard it, and suddenly the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, "Come out, you three, to the tabernacle of testimony." So the three came out to the tabernacle, when the Lord descended in the pillar of cloud and stood upon the door of the tabernacle of testimony. And he called Aaron and Miriam, and both went forward. And then he said, "Hear now my words. Should a prophet of yours belong to the Lord, I would make myself known to him in a vision. I would speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house." And we're going to see here that there is great faithlessness in Israel. We are going to see that in just a few minutes with the story of the spies. But Moses is the faithful one. At least at this point, he is the one faithful in all of the house. God says, "I speak with him face to face, even in visible form, not in obscure sayings." And he saw the Lord's glory. "Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" So the Lord's anger was aroused against them, and he departed. And the implication here is that to speak against God's chosen, to speak against the leader that God has appointed, is to speak against God himself. It is to deny the order that God has established. Moses is the faithful one, and God has set him over the people, and God speaks to him. God draws near to him in ways that he does not with others. And if God does this, Aaron and Miriam, and you know that he does this, why are you not afraid to speak against him? And so after God says these things, he departs. But when the cloud departed from the tabernacle, suddenly Miriam became leprous, white as snow. And we're told here in the note from the Orthodox Study Bible, Miriam's contentious and bitter spirit caused her to become leprous. Leprosy was a type of sin, and sin, such as a contentious spirit, eat away at the soul. And the fact that the punishment is put upon Miriam and not upon Aaron tells us that she was really the instigator here. She was really the one who drew Aaron into this type of rebellion against Moses. Aaron turned towards Miriam and saw that there she was, a leper, white as snow. And Aaron says to Moses, "Please pray for her. Do not let her be one dead like a miscarriage. Do not let her be as one dead, like a miscarriage with its flesh half consumed." And so Moses cries out to pray for her. Then the Lord said to Moses, "If her father had but spit in her face, would she not be shamed 7 days? Let her be shut out of the camp 7 days, and afterward let her enter." So Miriam was shut out 7 days, and the people did not break camp until Miriam was cleansed. And so Miriam bears the punishment here for the rebellion of herself and Aaron against Moses. So we see faithlessness in the grumbling of the people against God. And we see a kind of faithlessness, a kind of rebellion against God in the rebellion against Moses, a rebellion coming from his own brother and sister, who would not recognize his special relationship with God and the duties to which God had appointed him. They had no faith in God's having chosen Moses above themselves. This is a prelude to the central example of faithlessness that we see in the story of Numbers, the story of the people on their way as an army to the Promised Land. And that story has to do with the spies who are sent into the Promised Land before the people would attack. Starting here in chapter 13 of Numbers. So the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a ruler among them." And we're told the names of the different men who were sent, notably from the tribe of Judah, Caleb, and from the tribe of Ephraim, Joshua. These are two figures that we will meet again in the story. So Moses says to the men who will go to spy out the land, "Go up to this desert and go up to the mountain, and you will see the land and the people who dwell on it. What are they? Are they strong or weak, few or many? Also, what is the land that they dwell in? Is it good or bad? Then, too, what about the cities they inhabit? Are they walled or unwalled? Then again, what about the ground? Is it fertile or neglected? Are there trees on it? Persevere, and you shall receive some of the fruits of the land." In military circles, what the spies are doing is called reconnaissance. They're going to see what the strengths and weaknesses of the people are, as well as the character of the land itself. They're going to assess, for a military operation, what kind of enemy it is that they are going to be fighting. They're going to see what kind of challenges lie ahead. And so the people went up through the spies went up through the desert and came to Hebron. They come to other places in the land. And they come to the valley of Eshcol, and they surveyed it and cut down a branch there with one cluster of grapes. And they carried it between two of them on a pole. So it's a very large cluster of grapes if it has to be carried by two men. They also brought some of the pomegranates and the figs. So they bring some of the produce of the land, some of its richness and its bounty. And then they returned from spying out the land after 40 days. And they departed and came back to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the children of Israel in the desert of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. So they come back and they say, "Here is all the goodness, here is all the bounty of the land. Look at what we have brought back." Then they told Moses, and they said, "We went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there." And this is all imposing. This is a kind of warning. You see where most of the spies are going here. The people are strong. The cities are fortified and large. There is a worthy enemy here. There are people of strength. Then Caleb speaks, and he says, "No, but let us go up at once and take possession of the land, for we are well able to overcome them." Caleb sees where the initial message of the rest of the spies is going and says, no, we need to go and do this. Caleb believes. Caleb does not doubt the promises of God. He rests in those promises. We are able to take this people, he says. And without actually saying it, surely his belief is behind his words. God is on our side. But the other spies, the men who went up with him then said, "We are not going up, for we are unable to go up against them, because they are stronger than we." And so the spies instilled a terror for the land, which they spied out among the children of Israel, saying, "The land through which we went as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, and we seemed like grasshoppers to them. but so we actually were." End quote. And so they say, the army of God, who is 600,000 strong, 600,000 strong, they say, we are not able to take this land, and the implication being that God is not able to provide it for them. Chapter 14, verse 1, "Now all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. All the children of Israel were murmuring against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, 'Would that we had died in the land of Egypt or in this desert. Why did the Lord bring us to this land to fall in war? Our wives and children shall be plundered. It is better for us to return to Egypt.' So they said to one another, 'Let us select a ruler and return to Egypt.' And Moses and Aaron, hearing this from the people, fell on their faces. And Joshua and Caleb, two of the spies, tore their clothes. And Joshua and Caleb speak to the congregation on all of the people of Israel, and they say, 'The land we passed through to spy out is an extremely good land. Since the Lord chooses us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. But do not apostatize from the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our food. Their time has come and gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not fear them.' Then all the congregation said to stone them with stones." There's a great deal of tension in this story at this point, because the army of God has come, the army of the people of Israel has come to this point to take the promised land. The spies have been sent, and they come back. And the consensus among the spies, minus the two dissenters, is that this cannot be done. The people of the land are big and strong, and the cities are fortified. We cannot take them. What we have here for the people of Israel, their faithlessness, is a contest between the promise of God, the word of God, and what he says he will do for them, and the testimony of their eyes, what they actually see. Now, I want to imagine here, just for the sake of argument and perhaps for the sake of embellishment, let's imagine that all of the Israelites stand about 5'5" or so. They're slightly below average height men, even though there's 600,000 of them, 650,000. But let's imagine that all of the Canaanites and the people in the land are 6'4", and there's a lot of them. And so you have a bunch of men who are not exactly physically imposing against a bunch of men who are big and brawny and muscular, well-fed, and again, strong. And those who are of smaller stature say, "We are like grasshoppers before these men. The testimony of our eyes is that we will not be able to defeat them. God will not bring us into this land." Why? Because he cannot overcome the physical disparity between us and them. That the physical disparity of us being grasshoppers and them being giants is in fact stronger than the power of God that brought us out of Egypt. That is what they are saying. Their faithlessness is that they cannot handle the counter evidence to the promise of God. Their faith has been tested. Their faith has been tested by what they see, because what they see says to them, God will not make good on his word. God says he will do this, but I see that. And the thing that I actually see, the physical reality, is more real to me than the spiritual reality. Therefore, I do not believe. This is the test of faith. Stepping away from the story and just making a more general point, this is very often for those of us who pray or those of us who ask God for help. This is very often the test. The test is when we seek something from God, even if we seek it humbly and truly, if we seek it with contrition. And before we receive that thing, we are confronted with counter evidence. We are confronted with something that says, this will not happen. We are confronted with something that says, no, God cannot overcome this. And the idea, the struggle here, the test of faith, is to have faith in spite of the counter evidence, in spite of the testimony of one's eyes or of one's ears, of the physical reality that says God cannot bring his word to pass. God is not faithful because he can't do this. And so the people show this great faithlessness, this great lack of rest in God's promises. And they have a great disturbance, a great anxiety that rumbles among them. Let us go back to Egypt. Let us even select a ruler and return to Egypt and go back and be slaves, because God cannot do this for us. Why has he brought us out here? It's interesting to think as well about the words of Caleb. He says, this is a good land, and God will bring us into this land and give it to us. The Lord chooses us. That is Caleb's faith here. God has said, let us have faith in God then, since he has spoken. Do not apostatize from the Lord, he says, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our food. Such faith and confidence Caleb has, so unlike his brethren. He says in addition, their time has come and gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. It's really interesting to think about what we know about the people in the land and what it is that Caleb sees. Because the people are big, we get that. They're much bigger than the Israelites, and they're strong. The cities are fortified. There seems to be a great deal of strength there. But what else did we learn about the people in Leviticus? We learned that there is a sexual free-for-all among these people. We learned that they evidently have habits of sexual relations with their near of kin. That they don't know not to sleep with their sister or their father's wife. There's a great deal of self-indulgence among this people. Everything from the land, it seems, is oversized. The people are oversized. The fruit is oversized. And the cluster of grapes has to be carried by 2 men. The desires and the passions of the people are also oversized. Everything about the people, it seems, that we are told, and about the land where they are, is oversized. And what does this tell us? The people may be big and strong and more physically built than most folks, most other people who are around, certainly more than the Israelites. But they're also slaves to their passions. They're also unable to be with one another without being rapacious towards one another. Caleb says their time has come and gone. What does he see about them that tells him this? On the one hand, it's the promise of God. God is going to give us the land. This is our time. We are the ones who are approaching. We are the ones who are ascending. We will come and occupy this land. But at the same time, as he walks among the people and as he sees them, he sees that they are complete slaves to their passions. He sees that the fabric of their society is unwoven. That it very much seems that they have forgotten what it means to be responsible and accountable towards one another, to live with one another in harmony. All of this we can extrapolate. Their time has come and gone, but the Lord is with us. Have faith, he says. But the people have shown that they do not have faith. So what happens? The Lord then spoke to Moses, how long will this people provoke me? I will strike them with death and destroy them, and I will make you and your father's house into a great and more numerous nation than this one. The people have sinned against me, God says, and so I will destroy all of them and start again with you, Moses. And we saw this same reaction in the story of the golden calf. And Moses again steps up and intercedes for the people. Oh God, please don't do this. The other peoples will say that the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land which he swore to them. Now then, let your strength, O Lord, be exalted in the manner you spoke, said Moses. Moses says to God, do you not remember? The Lord is long-suffering and abundant in mercy and truth, taking away lawlessness, wrongdoings, and sins. Remit the sin of this people, Moses says, according to your great mercy, as you were merciful to them from Egypt, even until now. Continue to be merciful, Moses says. Forgive their sins. And God responds, straightway to Moses, I am merciful to them, according to your word. But truly, as I live, God continues, and my name lives, and the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, assuredly, all the men who are seeing my glory and signs which I did in Egypt and in this desert, and put me to the test now these 10 times, and did not heed my voice, they certainly shall not see the land I swore to their fathers, but their children, to these I shall give the land. So all of those who were faithless will not enter the promised land. If they do not rest in the promise of God, God will not give them the designated place of rest. Moreover, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, How long shall I bear with this evil congregation who murmur against me? Say to them, As I live, says the Lord, surely in the manner you spoke in my hearing, so I will do to you. Your bodies shall fall in this desert, and all your census who were numbered from 20 years old and above, as many as murmured against me, and you shall not enter the land upon which I stretched out my hand, that you might settle upon it. But your bodies shall fall in this desert. However, your sons shall be shepherds in the desert 40 years, and shall bear your fornication until your bodies are consumed in the desert. According to the number of the days you spied out the land, 40 days, for each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year, namely 40 years, and you shall know my fierce anger. The people had said, Would that we had died in this desert. Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, they say, or again, in this desert. Why did the Lord bring us to this land to fall in war? And so God says, As you have spoken, so let it be done to you. Your bodies shall fall in this desert. You shall be here for 40 years. You shall suffer 1 year for each of the days that the spies were in the land. At this point, I want to bring in St. Caesarius of Arles, who has something to say to us on the punishment of 40 years and how we might think of it as in relation to ourselves. He says, and I quote, For my part, I am afraid to examine the secrets of this mystery, for I see comprehended in it the calculation of sins and punishment. If each sinner is assigned punishment for the sin of 1 day, and according to the number of days he sins, must spend so many years in punishment, I fear that perhaps for us who sin daily, and who spend no day of our life without offense, even ages and ages will not suffice to pay our penalties. And the fact that for 40 days of sin, those people were afflicted in the desert for 40 years and not permitted to enter the Holy Land, a kind of similarity to the future judgment seems to be evident. At that time, the number of sins will have to be calculated, unless perchance there is the balance of good works or of evils which a man has suffered in his life, as Abraham taught concerning Lazarus. However, it is within the power of no one to know these things perfectly, except to him to whom the Father has given all judgment. End quote. In other words, we see the Israelites punished 1 year for each of the 40 days that the spies went into the land. And so therefore let us imagine that we were to be punished with perdition for 1 year for each of the days that we were faithless and sinned against God. And when we think about this, we perhaps will come to some idea of what perdition means in its duration. Perhaps we will have some notion of the gravity and the consequences of our own faithlessness if we do not repent and turn to God from the heart. And so the people spend 40 years in the desert so that the older generation may pass and the younger generation, all of those younger than 20 years old, may grow up and take its place. And as for the men that Moses sent to spy out the land after the people say these things, those very men who spoke evil words against the land died by the plague before the Lord. So another plague strikes the people from God. And the men, the spies who had gone, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, perish in the plague. Now the people are upset with themselves because they have sinned against God, and they realize the punishment that they now must endure. And so still being confirmed in their stubbornness, they decide that they're going to invade anyway. They rose early in the morning and went up to the top of the mountain, saying, "Here we are, and we will go up to the place the Lord spoke about, for we have sinned." But Moses said to them, "Why now do you transgress the word of the Lord? For this will not be easy for you. Do not go up," that is, don't go up against the people of Canaan, "for the Lord is not with you, and you shall fall before the face of your enemies. Because you have turned away from and disobeyed the Lord will not be among you." But they rebelled. They went anyway. And they went up to the mountaintop, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord nor Moses moved from the camp. God was not with them when they went. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who dwelt in that mountain came down and attacked the sons of Israel and turned them back and cut them down as far as Hormah, and they returned to the camp. So we see a kind of weak, fledgling attempt to attack the Canaanites without the blessing and the presence of God, and the Israelites are defeated. And it seems at this point that given their faithlessness, given their inability to believe that God will make good on his promises, their lack of rest in God's word, they are now faced with 40 years in the desert, 40 years of wandering, with the purpose of the older generation dying so that the younger generation may take its place. We will pick up with the story here in Numbers in the next episode.
The Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua with Dr. Daniel Cantey. Dr. Cantey taught religion and philosophy at Bethel University from 2012 to 2019. He is a graduate of Yale Divinity School and Emory University and lives with his family in Clarksville, Tennessee. This has been a listener and viewer-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.